So welcome everyone to the Beatitudes Center. I'm John, Father John Deere. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's so exciting that I get to introduce you to my friend, actually two of my friends today. And so this is part of our ongoing series. Just a few notes about the Zoom. Ruth Ann Angus there on your screen is the co-host. Ruth Ann, can you all hear me? Is this working out okay?
I can hear you. I hope
Okay.
everybody shake your heads if you can hear.
Okay, good. Because we sometimes have problems. We're in a remote place coming to you from the central coast of California. If I get disconnected, hopefully it'll continue. That's happened once so far, and Ruth Ann will keep going. So Robert, you just keep going and just ignore me, and hopefully I'll join you. If we both get disconnected, well, we'll try to all come back on. It hasn't happened yet, God willing. Um, but we ask you all to mute yourselves if you're not already muted. And the theory here is that, you all know Zoom now, that if you have questions for Robert or Sister Helen, you can type them in the chat. And I really invite you to think, because we only have so much time with Robert, think of a good, serious, good question to put him on the spot about the Beatitudes and the saints. And let's work, Robert, and get engaged, because he is the global expert, the greatest of all time on the saints, the GOAT. Sorry, Robert, I had to say that. So the format, I'm going to give a little 2-second in prayer. I'm going to give a little 2-second introduction to Robert, because I wrote that 10-page biography of him. And then, I've invited Robert to speak for 45 minutes. This is such a holy topic, and we've got his times. But whatever you want to do, Robert, on the theme of Beatitudes and the saints. And then we have a very close friend and the great one and only author of Dead Man Walking, Sister Helen Prejean, who's with us today. So I asked Helen if she would respond to Robert. And, Helen, whatever, I don't know, speak for 10 minutes about what you thought of what Robert was saying. And then we'll open it up to everybody. And Ruth Ann will also help sort through the chat. And we're going to go for an hour and a half. Does that sound like a good plan for everybody? Okay, so let's just have a 2-second prayer then before I introduce Robert. So I invite you to just take a deep breath and center yourself here on the vigil of Pentecost as we prepare for Pentecost. And I invite us into the presence of the God of peace who loves us, and to Jesus and the whole communion of saints. Let's take a moment in silence to ask for whatever graces we need on this Pentecost weekend. So, beloved God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us this weekend, this Pentecost weekend, as we hear our friend reflect on the Beatitudes and the saints, and inspire us and strengthen us and heal us and re-energize us, that we might be your Beatitude people, that we too might be your saints and peacemakers and servants and friends of the nonviolent Jesus, sent on a mission to bring peace and justice to our poor world. We ask this mighty blessing in Jesus' name. Amen. So I'm happy to introduce many of you I know to my longtime friend, Robert Ellsberg, who, as you read, is the editor and publisher of Orbis books. Before that, he had been at Harvard and the Catholic Worker. I'm not sure which is greater. Work for Dorothy Day. Now, I'm going to embarrass my friend because I have a little show and tell. But so he's published 1,000 great books at Orbis over, I think, 75 years he's been there. I'm not sure. But in the 1990s, he wrote this book, which really had a huge effect on the church around the world. I am not kidding you this, because it launched a whole new genre on the saints. It's called All Saints. It's Saints for Every Day. This has never been done before since a guy named Butler. Butler's Lives of the Saints. You heard about that? And Robert, you only did one volume. He did 4, so you got more work to do. Anyway, if you don't have this book, folks, you got to get it. Robert's written many others. This is one of his latest, which is one of my favorite books, A Living Gospel, Reading God's Story in Our Holy Lives. It's a gorgeous book. 3 weeks ago, he published this book, Lead Kindly Like Gandhi on Christianity. That's just showing off because this week he published this book. He edited Dorothy Day on Pilgrimage the 60s. It's incredible. It's fantastic accomplishment. But as you know, Robert was the editor of the Catholic Worker in Dorothy's last years, and then became her editor and published the selected writings of Dorothy Day. And then he worked on this mammoth collection, The Duty of Delight, the Diaries of Dorothy Day. Wow, what a great, great book and collection. Then he did The Letters of Dorothy Day. This is just showing off, Robert, All the Way to Heaven. And he's on the committee with the Vatican and New York City. Don't let any of my facts get in the way of a good story here, Robert, for the canonization of Dorothy, which is going to happen. But because of Robert, we have books on liberation theology, Oscar Romero, his great friend Henry Nouwen, Franz Jägerstätter. The list goes on and on, Robert's contribution to the church. And as you know, he's the son of the great Daniel Ellsberg, who just turned 90 and is in the New York Times today for leaking documents showing how close we came to nuclear war in 1958. So Robert's been a great friend of mine. I'm really happy that you, my friends, get to meet my friend, and that you're going to get to hear from my other friend, Sister Helen Prejean, afterwards. So Robert, the floor is yours. I'm going to mute myself so you can be relieved. And welcome, Robert. We're all very excited to have you. So how about a round of applause, even though you're muted, to welcome Robert Ellsberg. All right, welcome, Robert, from New York.
Thank you, John. And
You gave me a day of taking off work.
make sure we're all muted. Okay. And thank you for the generous introduction. I told him to tone it down a little bit more, and so I am grateful that he left out the part he usually mentions about how I was one of the original 5th Beatles before I decided instead to go in a different direction and went to the Catholic Worker in Harvard, as he mentioned, and other things brings me here today. But John is one of my oldest friends, a real peacemaker, one who embodies many of these Beatitudes. And I'm very honored that you would ask me to talk about them today. I'm looking at the clock so that I can try to keep this down to 45 minutes because I could sort of expand this and talk about it all day. So I'm going to try to move along. The Beatitudes and the Saints. I was interested and glad that John invited me to enter into the story of the Beatitudes by way of the saints. To be a Christian is to be a follower of Christ. I think we can accept that. And it's not something that we achieve all at once. It's a journey that continues throughout our life. It's an ongoing effort to adapt our story to the story of Jesus. Many of us, probably most of us, do that in a haphazard way some of the time, or maybe on our better days. Then there are those who take that calling with the utmost seriousness. We could say that they walk the path of holiness, the way of the saints. We're all called to walk that path, but we know that most of us stray. And so we have the saints to serve as models and reminders of what that looks like, what a Christ-like life looks like. They don't do the work for us, and they don't just serve as objects of admiration or veneration, but to inspire us on our own path to be braver, more faithful, more loving, more forgiving. As John mentioned, I was very fortunate to spend some years working with Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker, who probably doesn't need a lot of introduction for this audience, who died in 1980. And I certainly had no doubt at the time that she was a saint. And now she is, as John mentioned, on her way to being officially recognized as such by the Catholic Church. Her public record and life speaks for itself. But as John mentioned, I had the privilege of editing her diaries some years ago, and it offered me an opportunity to see, more of the inner life that lay behind her actions. They showed me a woman who held up her everyday life against the standards of the gospel, measuring and testing her own capacity for love, for forgiveness, for patience in her everyday work and encounters with other people. Living like that doesn't make somebody a perfect person, but it leads toward a kind of transparency so that it becomes possible to see something of the mercy and love and justice of God shining through our flawed human actions and attitudes, even as we are aware of how often we fall short. Dorothy herself relied on the saints for inspiration and guidance. And when we look at such people or hang around them, we're reminded of Jesus, and that's ultimately what it means to be a saint. It's true that Dorothy didn't like it when people called her a saint. Everybody knows that, because she knew that when we speak of saints, we tend to put them on a pedestal as if they were perfect and not flawed human beings. And that can actually have the effect of discouraging us from taking the saints seriously or taking our own call to holiness seriously. We're not called to be another St. Francis or another Dorothy Day. As Pope Francis says, we become saints by, quote, living our lives with love and by bearing witness in everything we do, wherever we find ourselves. That means, he says, discovering and living out the message that God wants to speak to the world by our lives. So we might say, well, it would be great if Jesus had just laid out a handbook for holiness, a guidebook of how to be a saint. And here our fixation on canonization and the official criteria for naming saints can distract us from the handbook of holiness that Jesus actually did lay out in the Sermon on the Mount, which begins with the series of blessings known as the Beatitudes, which is the subject of our meeting today. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are the meek, and so forth. Pope Francis calls the Beatitudes a Christian's identity card. They outline a series of virtues or attitudes that together create a portrait of Jesus himself, the underlying attitudes that informed his actions and his teachings. They're none of the Beatitudes that Jesus himself didn't demonstrate and embody, from spiritual poverty to a hunger for righteousness and ultimately to persecution. We can't imitate Jesus by walking on water or changing water into wine, but by reflecting on the Beatitudes and by looking at people like us who have adopted these virtues, we can see how we can follow and imitate Jesus in our own lives. So my plan is to discuss these Beatitudes in turn with reference to some examples of saints and holy people. But before I do that, I wanted to make just a few observations. First of all, I think it's significant to note that the Beatitudes are rather different from the criteria for canonization. There's nothing here about doctrinal orthodoxy or miracles. At the time when Jesus delivered this sermon, there was no church. There were no Christian doctrines or liturgies or canon law. He was pointing toward a new spirit, a new way of being in the world to which we were invited and all were welcome. Secondly, even when we discuss these Beatitudes in turn, they're obviously not discrete and separate virtues. Perhaps we can think of people who seem to embody one in particular or another, like Mother Teresa, an icon of mercy, or Oscar Romero, but each of them really leads seamlessly into the others. In general, the saints were not single virtue specialists. They were people of the Beatitudes. They embodied these attitudes and they put their own special stamp on them so that by looking at them, we can understand them in a new way. And they help us see new dimensions of the meaning of the Beatitudes, whether in the time of Rome or in the Middle Ages or today in the context of climate change. The final point I want to bring out is the radical spirit of these Beatitudes. We might think of them as just a matter of being a really nice person, meek, merciful, not bothering anybody, always considerate and polite, always wearing a smile, even when you're mourning. But at the best of times, these Beatitudes run against the flow of the dominant culture. In many cases, they completely turn upside down the values of society. And thus they can pose a radical challenge to the powers of this world. It's good to remember the original context in which Jesus delivered these Beatitudes. In the time of the Roman Empire, an age that literally worshiped power and made a fetish of cruelty and violence, and organized all of humanity into categories of people, from those on the top to those on the bottom, who had no rights and no real worth. So Jesus comes into that world and he outlines a completely different set of values. What does it mean in such a world to value the poor in spirit, the meek, the merciful, the peacemaker? These are values that make absolutely no sense in terms of the value structures of his time. They represent a kind of blasphemy against the gods of the empire and the social order. And so under these circumstances, there's not one of these Beatitudes that cannot lead to persecution and even death. If being poor in spirit means standing with the poor, that can mean you're a communist. If being merciful means sheltering a refugee or hiding a Jew in Nazi-occupied Holland, if being a peacemaker means refusing to kill or interfering with plans to make war, well, you see where I'm going. I think the radical nature of these Beatitudes stands out in a particularly strong way in this era of Trump, with all the emphasis on being great, on being number one, mocking the weak, the poor, the disabled, the disdain for losers, people from shithole countries. Jesus never said it would be easy. He came out and offered a fair warning when he said, "This is the way of the cross." So yes, it calls us to new life, but by means of leaving something behind, choosing a different way of living. And if we aren't interested or ready to accept that challenge, then this might not be the way for us. But if the gospel asks us to relinquish some of the prizes and rewards that this world offers, the Beatitudes also point to an alternative reward: mercy, comfort, the kingdom of heaven, to see God. Well, that's not so bad. So let's begin at the beginning with the Beatitudes. The very first one, blessed are the poor in spirit. Jesus starts out right out of the gate with the first of his blessings to really throw it down to the Roman dream or the American dream or any dream of any culture that says the goal of life is to be on the top of the heap, to be number one. Right from the beginning, Jesus is saying, let go of all that. He's going to be pointing toward a different dream, a different hierarchy of value. Now, the Gospel of Luke obviously says something different. There, Jesus says plain out, blessed are the poor. But Matthew's Beatitudes are a manual for discipleship. It's hard to see how you can be poor in spirit without making an option for the poor. But here he's talking about something that comes first. First is the call to everyone to uproot the hierarchy in our minds and hearts that tells us that wealth, prosperity, and power are the signifiers of value and meaning. So he's not talking about how much income or property is the right amount to have. He's saying that we have to stop buying into a grasping, acquisitive spirit in which we identify ourselves with what we own and consume. And that causes us to judge or value other people on the basis of what they have or consume. I think that message has an even more radical countercultural import in our present day capitalist society, in which the whole economy and market and culture is driven by stimulating the desire or the need to have and obtain more. Those very values underlie the immediate threat to our planet through climate change. This countercultural beatitude is the antidote to an economy built on the short-term maximizing of profit at the expense of the earth and its marginalized populations. But this isn't something that just began with Trump University or something. The early Desert Fathers were onto this. In practicing voluntary poverty, they insisted that the issue wasn't just in things themselves, but in this spirit of attachment, acquisitiveness, attachment to things. One of them said, you could give up all your wealth, you could give up every kingdom and be just as fixated on a pencil or a pin. The real problem was not the things, it was the hook of attachment in one's own heart. So to be poor in spirit was to detach that hook. Probably the saint who really reinvented the radical meaning of this beatitude was Saint Francis, not just something to be practiced by ascetics in the desert, but as a spirit for renewing the church, transforming the world, bringing the whole church back to the spirit of that beatitude that had been so forgotten in a church that had bought into the trappings and the pomp and the display of its own kind of version of empire. You remember that St. Francis himself came from a prosperous family in Assisi. His father was a wealthy cloth merchant. And Francis went through this conversion by stages that began when he was a prisoner of war and then became very sick and began to wander around the countryside, kind of wondering what his life was really for. And he came upon this leper. And at first he was going to just give some alms to the leper, but then some impulse made him kiss the leper. And in doing that, he was letting go of a whole kind of identity and status according to the values of his world. He was taking on a completely new agenda, the terms of which were defined by those at the bottom, those who were hurting, those who were poor, those who were suffering, not identifying with this upwardly mobile, commercial culture that he was part of, a world that caused wars and that marginalized the poor and lepers and the sick and that sort of thing. So that became the basis of his movement, of the Franciscans, and it kind of spread like wildfire throughout Europe, and had really, the potential to transform the church and society. Except, like many radical ideas like that, it tended to get institutionalized, and it tended to get maybe segregated into, okay, that's okay for Franciscans, but what does that have to do with the rest of us? I think the person in our time who most adopted the spirit of St. Francis and that radical spirit of poverty for the church was Dorothy Day. Of course, the Catholic Worker was founded in the Depression, and it was an effort to live out the radical spirit of the Gospels. But Dorothy, unlike other religious communities that just focused on the works of mercy from the kind of safe and secure distance of a convent or a monastery, got right down there into the slums, embracing the kind of vulnerability or what she called precarity that is an essential kind of aspect of the life of the poor. She believed that comfort and security put up a wall around us that makes it even hard for us to even see our brothers and sisters in need. And so voluntary poverty from the beginning was an essential expression of the Catholic worker. And the fruit of this was a kind of freedom and openness, an availability for whatever mission God might send her. And it had the effect of making her fearless because there was nothing that she was really afraid of losing. St. Francis had said that, when you have property, then you need to have police, and you need to have armies, and you have to have wars to protect that, so that your possessions actually possess you in a way. And he saw that as the fruit of the source of violence in society. And Dorothy believed, very much the same thing, that stripping ourselves, not just of property, but of all those things that kind of interfere with our capacity for community and solidarity with our fellow human beings, was a source of violence. And you can look at various episodes in her life that kind of illustrate, that sort of freedom. I think of, I've just finished editing her writings from the 1970s, which reminded me of the time in 1973 when the IRS came and tried to shut her down, saying that she owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes. Dorothy had never paid any federal tax. She didn't have any income, and she never registered as a recognized charitable organization. And you really see her going head to head with the federal government here, and prepared to be out on the street if that's what she thought they could take the Catholic worker away from her. And she didn't then kind of trim her conscience, to fit her security here in her senior years. She was She was 75 at the time. I think of another story that about Dorothy's attitude or relationship to property, and some of you know this story about how someone once donated a diamond ring to the Catholic worker, and everybody wondered what Dorothy Day was going to do with it. She could obviously sell that ring, and it would pay for a lot of beans for the soup kitchen. As it was said to Jesus, that precious oil could have been sold and given to the poor. And Dorothy surprised everybody by giving the diamond ring to this homeless woman who hung around the Catholic worker, and not just any old lovable homeless worker. She was a really obnoxious person who had the nickname the Weasel. Nobody particularly liked her at all. Why on earth would you give this, to her? You could have sold the ring, given her the money. She said, well, she can do whatever she wants with the ring. She can sell it herself and use it to go on a holiday or pay her rent, or she could wear it. She said, do you suppose that God only made diamonds for the rich? Anyway, a little parable of Dorothy and her practice of this kind of art of letting go. And of course, we don't just cling to property, we cling to all kinds of things. Our sense of being in control, or of the conviction of being absolutely right. We even will cling to our miseries, resentments, anxieties. We can't imagine what it would be like to let go of those things. But the point is that Jesus is not just calling us to just give up stuff, but it's kind of to make room for something else in our hearts. That we're invited to begin a new journey in which we're not identified with what we have or what we desire, but to take on a different sense of what is important, what's valuable, what's ultimately meaningful. Where our treasure is, that's where our heart is. So what are we giving this all up for? For the sake of what? Jesus says, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. And so that's where the Beatitudes begin. I try not to spend so much time on all of them. We move on next to, blessed are those who mourn. And that's an interesting one. It sounds kind of dark and depressing. Being poor in spirit, you think of St. Francis or something, that can sound like there's a certain kind of freedom and joy attached to this, but blessed are those who mourn. It makes it sound as if we should just be morose and sad all the time. But I don't think that's what it means. I think it has more to do with Pope Francis meant. When early on in his papacy, he went and said his first mass outside of Rome on the island of Lampedusa in the Mediterranean, where so many migrants and refugees have died at sea. He said, making the Mediterranean itself into a kind of watery cemetery. And Pope Francis quoted the words of God to Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" He was pointing at the indifference of a world that looks on suffering and says, what does that have to do with me? Am I my brother's keeper? The Pope says, has any of us wept because of this situation and others like it? Has any one of us grieved for the death of these brothers and sisters? Has any one of us wept for these persons who were on the boat, for the young mothers carrying their babies? We are a society that has forgotten how to weep, how to experience compassion. The globalization of indifference has taken from us the ability to weep. I think that's what Jesus is addressing. It's not about being sad all the time. It means keeping our hearts open to the suffering of others, whether that's the cry of the poor or the cry of the earth, remaining sensitive to the sufferings of the world, not becoming jaded or desensitized, not exchanging our heart of flesh for a heart of stone. Abraham Heschel wrote in his great book about the prophets, writes about the pathos of God, God's suffering in the face of injustice, a God who hears the cry of the oppressed. And the prophets are those who share and are able to kind of channel that pathos of God. I think of one of our modern prophets, Dan Berrigan, who is just 100, if he'd been alive just a week or so ago. And remember the great statement he wrote on behalf of the Catonsville Nine. Our apologies, good friends, for the fraction of good order, the burning of paper instead of children, the angering of the orderlies in the front parlor of the charnel house We could not, so help us God, do otherwise. For we are sick at heart. Our hearts give us no rest for thinking of the land of burning children, and for thinking of that other child of whom the poet Luke speaks. The infant was taken up at the arms of the old man, whose tongue grew resonant and vatic at the touch of that beauty. He was addressing a world that cares more about the sanctity of law and order, whose heart is more offended by that, the burning of pieces of paper, than the burning of children. How to awaken the world to a capacity to mourn. Blessed are those who mourn, who care about others, even strangers, even those on the other side of the globe. I think last summer, back to the people all over the world who were shaken out of the slumber of indifference by the death of George Floyd in his last words, "I can't breathe." Black Lives Matter is a cry of affirmation, a cry for life, but it is rooted in an experience of pathos. You have to be able to feel something to make that affirmation. It's an expression of mourning that arises from a situation in which Black lives do not matter. What does it take for us to believe that future generations matter, that the earth matters? Without a capacity to mourn, how are we to address the plight of refugees dying in the desert or at sea, or the fate of people buried in our prison system? In this time of climate change, how are we to address this crisis if we're not capable of mourning the demise of a glacier, a rainforest, a coral reef, another few hundred species, maybe pointing the way toward our own demise? I think of the plowshares activists, some of whom are getting out of jail soon, who are mourning the victims of a catastrophe that has not yet happened, mourning a future for our grandchildren and future generations, mourning the passing of civilization, mourning the passing of a healthy planet, an ecosystem that supports millions of species, the poisoning of the earth, the water, the air, the destruction of everything we hold dear. Saints were attuned to the suffering around them. This was their gift, but it was also their cross. Some of you might know the story of Sister Anne Manganero, who worked with a Catholic worker in Kansas City. She was a Loreto sister and a doctor. I know Scott Wright is here and knew her well, who spent years among the poor and refugees in El Salvador. And she was dying of breast cancer. And she said, "I'm thinking of the wounds." And people said, "Well, what wounds? Your own wounds? The wounds of Christ? The wounds of El Salvador?" And she said, "No, the wounds of everyone, the wounds of us all." I think of Jean Donovan, the American lay missioner who was one of the 4 church women killed by the Salvadoran army in 1980. She'd considered the advice of people who told her she should get out of the country. 2 weeks before her death, she wrote, "Several times I've decided to leave. I almost could, except for the children, the poor, bruised victims of adult lunacy. Who would care for them? Whose heart would be so staunch as to favor the reasonable thing in a sea of their tears and loneliness? Not mine, dear friend, not mine." Blessed are those whose hearts do not allow them to do the reasonable thing in a sea of tears and loneliness. Blessed are those who remember and recognize Christ's wounds and the wounds of the world, and who remember to mourn. Jesus says they shall be comforted. So now we come to blessed are the meek. It's not a word we use a lot, and a world that prizes greatness, bigness, being number one. Meekness is not a highly touted virtue. It goes by definition unnoticed and generally unrewarded. But Jesus once more turns the usual hierarchies upside down. The last shall be first. Those who would be first of all must become the servants of all. Being meek in this world means learning the power that lies in small things and what is apparently humble and insignificant. It means learning to listen to the quiet, delicate equilibrium of the earth itself. It doesn't push and shove to take the first place. It's the gentle, nonviolent power that is hidden in apparent weakness. Again, think of the absurdity of celebrating meekness in the context of the Roman Empire, the glory that is Rome, or in the context of making America great again. And to the extent that spirit still holds sway here in the center of a new global empire, we can recognize the subversive power of this beatitude of meekness. And again, in this era of climate change, the importance of this beatitude is clear. It stands against the mentality that drives an economy and a system that's destroying the earth, digging up all the buried resources of oil, gas, coal, whatever, to fuel our economy, fueling the profits of the elite, rolling over whatever stands in the way, sacred native lands, the continent of Africa, the Amazonian rainforest, the Arctic, a culture of bigness, power, success, greatness that threatens to turn our planet into a wasteland. And then Jesus points toward a different way, the way of littleness, the way of meekness, and the secret that there's actually another kind of power there. One of the people who most, I think, exemplified that kind of power and left that as a kind of spiritual path was Saint Therese of Lisieux, who happened to be Dorothy Day's favorite saint, a Carmelite sister who died at a very young age, 1897, in a Carmelite monastery in Normandy, and became known through the posthumous publication of her autobiography, where she described her own kind of science of holiness, sanctification, that she called the little way, which meant doing all of your everyday kind of actions and chores and your encounters with people, but doing that in a spirit of love and finding God in that moment. And that could turn any occasion, whatever you were doing, suffering any kind of boredom or inconvenience or the irritation of your fellow members of your community, into an arena for holiness. And Dorothy took that and grasped that and felt, I think, discovered that that was exactly what the Catholic worker was, a school of that kind of little way. And you read her diaries and you see how much her own spirituality was focused on just her everyday kind of encounters, her efforts to restrain her judgment, her anger, to be more forgiving, to be more loving. And she doesn't just leave it there. She felt that there were spiritual implications, social implications beyond her daily life to this little way. And she wanted to the world to know about that. The power of little things. It might be just a handful of people going to jail to protest civil defense drills, or standing on a street corner with looking foolish with a sign that says peace, something that is nothing more than just a pebble dropped into a pond, but could have ripple effects beyond anything we could anticipate, that could reach across the world. One of Dorothy's favorite quotations, often appeared in the Catholic Worker, was this little passage from William James that deals with this kind of power. I am done with great things and big things, great institutions and big success, and I am for those tiny, invisible, molecular moral forces that work from individual to individual, creeping through the crannies of the world like so many rootlets, or like the capillary oozing of water, yet which, if you give them time, will rend the hardest monuments of man's pride. So blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. We move along to blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And it's not hard to hear there the radical challenge of this beatitude. It describes those who stubbornly refuse to accept the world as it is, all those who burn to see God's will fulfilled on earth as it is in heaven. We can hear that hunger in Mary's Magnificat. He has cast down the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent empty away. Imagine if that's your mother. It maybe, you know, she also was a great teacher of the Beatitudes, maybe to Jesus. A hunger for justice, a conviction that another world is possible that does not consign so many people to hunger for bread. I keep returning to Dorothy Day, and the fact that she felt it was not enough to feed the poor, but she had to set out to challenge and resist an economy or a structure, the systems that made so many people poor. And of course, that kind of hunger or questioning of the system can cause trouble for you. You think of Dom Helder Câmara, a great prophetic archbishop from Brazil, who said, "When I feed the poor, they call me a saint. When I ask why so many people are poor, they call me a communist." That hunger for righteousness is provoked by its absence, the domination of injustice and unrighteousness. But the emphasis for Jesus is on the dream of another way, not just what you're against, but what you're envisioning, what you're working for, what you are, what is driving you. And I think of that in the case of Dorothy too, who is not just motivated by hatred for the way things were, but by a hunger for something different, God's righteousness, or as Peter Morin liked to put it, a world where it's easier for people to be good. Martin Luther King was not just motivated by hatred for racial injustice, but by a hunger for justice, a hunger for the beloved community. That prophetic stance always balances denunciation and enunciation, naming what one opposes, but also naming what is one for, as Thomas Merton did when he said, "It's my intention to make my entire life a rejection of, a protest against the crimes and injustices of war and political tyranny. By my monastic vows, I'm saying no to all the concentration camps, the staged political trials, the judicial murders, etc." But he says, if I say no to all these secular forces, I also say yes to all that is good in the world and in man. I say yes to all that is beautiful in nature. As Martin Luther King says, the arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice, which I think is another way of saying, as Jesus says to these blessed, they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful. Mercy, as we know, has become the signature theme of Pope Francis, and he's constantly elaborated on this as a mode for expressing the mission of the church, its evangelization, its pastoral ministry, its engagement with the world, everything done in the key of mercy. And in that context, he's taken on the response to migrants and refugees as not just another aspect of social ministry, but as a crucial test of our Christian faith, which literally demonstrates our capacity to recognize Christ in our neighbors. As Jesus said, and as he likes to quote, "I was a stranger and you welcomed me." That line from Matthew 25 is the foundation for the works of mercy, that when we feed the hungry or give a drink to the thirsty or care for the sick or visit the prisoner, we're doing all these things directly to Christ. And that passage was foundational for Dorothy Day and the houses of hospitality she established for the practice of the works of mercy. She said, the mystery of the poor is this, that they are Jesus, and what we do for them, we do directly to him. Obviously, the implications of that are immense. Christ is present to us in the disguise of our neighbor, in the face of the poor, the marginalized, even those we regard as the other, the foreigner, even in the disguise of those we call the enemy. And what we do for them, whether feeding or starving them or sheltering or bombing them, we do directly to him. So it's very easy to see the radical direct implications of this kind of emphasis on mercy. And through the lens of Pope Francis, we can go back to the Gospels and see how much the practice of mercy was a central theme of Jesus's actions and teachings. And just as it provokes criticism or pushback against Pope Francis, it was a central cause that people took offense at Jesus because of his mercy toward sick women, outsiders, sinners, and that he put this mercy above practice of the law or sticking to his own kind, because we're scandalized by the mercy of God. Of course, we want mercy for ourselves, only judgment for others. But Jesus turns that completely upside down. I think of someone like Mother Maria Skoptsova. She was a Russian Orthodox nun, an emigre from Russia who came to Paris after the revolution. And she had children, she was divorced. The death of her daughter prompted a deep conversion in her. In her mourning, she was determined to seek a more authentic and purified life, she said. She saw a new road before me, a calling to be a mother for all, for all who need maternal care, assistance, or protection. And so she began doing social work among all the refugees in prisons, hospitals, mental asylums, slums. And she saw the religious dimension of this. Each person, she said, is the very icon of God incarnate in the world. And with this recognition, she felt a need to accept what she called the awesome revelation of God unconditionally, to venerate the image of God in her brothers and sisters. So she became a nun, but she wanted to become a nun in the world. Her cell was a cot in the basement of her house, which became both a study for renewal of orthodoxy, but also a soup kitchen. There was a chapel. She said, at the last judgment, I shall not be asked whether I was successful in my ascetic exercises, nor how many bows and prostrations I made. Instead, I shall be asked, did I feed the hungry, clothe the naked, visit the sick and the prisoners? Eventually, this mercy took on an even more dangerous aspect during the Nazi occupation, when she began rescuing and sheltering Jews. And when she was discovered, she and her confessor and her son were all arrested, and she ended up dying in the concentration camp in Ravensbrück. You could also think of a different kind of person, Oskar Schindler, of Schindler's List. Look at somebody like that who is not a conventionally good person. He's a philanderer, unfaithful to his wife. He's drinks, he gambles. Not to mention, he opportunistically joins the Nazi party and runs a factory built on slave labor. But you see this transformation that occurs in him, as depicted in the film, as he begins to realize the implications of the fact that the people who are working in his factories are human beings who are being consigned to death. And mercy becomes the entire business of his enterprise, a very dangerous mercy, in which he's doing everything he can to use all of his wits and all of his trickery to keep his workers alive, in defiance of the intentions of the Nazis, that they should all be fed into the ovens. You see the effect of how somebody seizes onto one of these Beatitudes and kind of takes it all the way, and it becomes a road to redemption, sanctification, if you want. It could become, it could begin on any of these points. So blessed are the merciful, Jesus says, they will be shown mercy. Now, blessed are the pure of heart. This is another interesting one, because we have an idea of what it means to be merciful, but what does it mean to be pure of heart? Purity of heart, or purity as a virtue, is typically assigned to holy women, commonly reduced to sexual continence. And this understanding is reinforced by a long line of martyrs, from St. Agnes to St. Maria Goretti, who died defending their virginity. I have problems with that kind of reading of these stories. In the case of so many of these so-called virgin martyrs, it's clear that their witness was not directed against sexuality, but against a culture of patriarchy that measured their only possible value and identity in terms defined by their gender. Whereas in Christ, they found a very different identity and sense of their own value. They also found a power to claim their own way. And that was a kind of blasphemy against the code of their world. And so they were tortured and they were killed in sadistic ways. But I think it very much reduces their witness to make that just a matter of preserving their virginity. I think of a famous passage of Thomas Merton where he writes about le point vierge, the virgin point in our souls, the sacred core of each person, something that is inviolable. And if we would see that in each person, we would be surrounded by a blinding light. It would be like seeing people walking around shining like the sun. So purity of heart is not the same as chastity. Perhaps a better way of thinking about it is honoring and safeguarding and living out of that inviolable virgin point in our hearts or our souls. I think of other contemporary women who have lived that out in a very different way, whether Joan of Arc, who refused to renounce her conscience or the voices who had called her on her mission. To renounce those voices would be to renounce herself, and she wouldn't do it. Or I think of someone like Anne Frank, confined to her annex, writing in her diary, a teenage girl, while this Nazi storm, these wolves are prowling all around her in this, this dangerous world she's living in, getting closer and closer. And yet in that little annex and in her diary, she's trying to record what's in her heart. And what's in her heart is this affirmation that there's something good, there's something more powerful than these forces that are closing in on her. And she wants to bear witness to that. I think of the purity of heart of someone like, again, Eddie Hillesum, a contemporary of Anne Frank's, an adult woman, Jewish woman, also in Holland, who ended up dying in Auschwitz, who also kept a diary, and whose diary also became a kind of a prayer or testimony about her inner life, and who saw with a clarity the evil all around her and what it was trying to do to her and her people, and felt that her vocation in that situation was to preserve and protect this little space for God in her heart. That would be her vocation. And if she could share this with other people, then maybe they wouldn't have to start at the beginning. She could pass that along to other people. She said, "I know that a new and kinder day will come. I would so much like to live on, if only to express all the love I carry within me. And there's only one way of preparing the new age, by living it even now in our hearts." So what's the reward for such people? Jesus says they shall see God. I'm going to skip along a little bit, if you don't mind. Maybe we can come back to it with John Deere here and somebody else. Maybe I don't have to spend so much time on the peacemakers. I just to remember that there was a Monty Python film, The Life of Brian, where there's this guy and he's on the outskirts of the Sermon on the Mount, and he's trying to hear what Jesus is saying, a little difficulty, and he says, "Blessed are the cheesemakers," and is puzzled by that. And someone says to him, "Well, I think you must be talking about some kind of metaphorical cheese." And I think, very much that we've taken the same thing with blessed are the peacemakers. Some kind of, Jesus must have been talking about some kind of metaphorical, peace. It's striking the way a message of Jesus that seems to be so, the most radical departure from the logic of his world, that we love our enemies, do good to those who harm you, and the nonviolence that he taught and preached and demonstrated even by his death on the cross should be all swept aside or interpreted in some kind of metaphorical way that it's not really supposed to apply once the empire is no longer persecuting Christians. There are people, of course, like Martin of Tours, who even after Christianity was recognized by the state, he was a Roman soldier, and when he became a Christian, he put down his weapons and said, "I can no longer fight because I'm a follower of Jesus." It's like he hadn't gotten the memo that this is Christianity 2.0. We're much more advanced now. We've moved beyond all of that. But yet there are all these people, throughout history, saints and holy people who have recalled and brought to mind and lived out that dangerous memory of Jesus's call to be peacemakers, who acted, in other words, as if the Sermon on the Mount was true. And I won't go through that whole, account of people we could talk about, like Dorothy Day and Ben Solomon and Thomas Merton and Daniel Berrigan. Jesus gives these peacemakers a new name. They shall be called children of God. Likewise, maybe I can, we can not spend as much time as necessary on blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. I don't think it's by chance that this comes at the end, because we've seen that all of these Beatitudes, if taken in the wrong sense, according to the powers of the world, can be seen as very dangerous and can lead to persecution. I think it is interesting that it follows right after the Beatitude on being a peacemaker. The The Beatitudes themselves, just have this, are a powerful weapon, you could say. And the example of that comes to mind is the story of Sister Dorothy Stang, an American nun who spent 40 years in Brazil. And her work with landless peasants, you probably know her story, put her in the way of ranchers and loggers who were trying to clear the Amazon. And one morning on February 12, 2005, she set off for a meeting of landless farmers. And along the muddy trail, her way was blocked by 2 hired gunmen who asked whether she carried any weapon. And in reply, she produced her Bible and began to read the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. And that's when they shot her. So essentially, to worship the God of life, the God of mercy, is to withhold worship from the gods of empire, of the marketplace, systems of injustice and violence. And we know what that can lead to. I think of, in a lot of our cases, while there are people who have paid this ultimate price for following the Beatitudes, in most cases, it's not the threat of death that holds us back. It would be inconvenient. It's get us into trouble with our neighbors or our boss. But you think of someone like a Franz Jägerstätter, Austrian peasant who was beheaded for refusing to serve in Hitler's army. Had no support from the church or anyone in his time. There are innumerable opportunities we face. Martyrdom isn't just standing in front of a firing squad. Often it's just doing something that costs us something. It's a witness that costs us something. It might not cost us everything, but it's not really a witness if it doesn't cost us something. And so we have to ask ourselves, what is our integrity? What is our soul? What is our sense of integrity worth to us? And what kind of price are we willing to pay for it? And we don't necessarily know that until we face the situation where that's even a real question. So I'll wrap things up. We come to the end of the Beatitudes, this Christian's identity card, as the Pope calls it. You'll recall that the Beatitudes are the gospel reading for the Feast of All Saints, which is a reminder that the saints are the best illustration of what these Beatitudes mean. They are the signature, they are the calling card of the Christian. But in each case, we've also seen that there's also a call, an invitation to join Jesus on the path of discipleship. They're calling us to a new way, a way that flows against the tide of the world. But they point to a different world, animated by different values, different priorities, different dreams. And as with any great journey, we create that path by walking it. So thank you. I'll conclude there.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I totally enjoyed that. As Paul said to John when he played him A Day in the Life the first time, that was brilliant. No, Robert, I don't listen to speakers. It's hard for me to listen to a speech, but it's the best talk I've ever heard on the Beatitudes. And I know so much of that, but I never heard anybody put it all together. So thank you so much.